I'm Karl Whittle from the University of Liverpool, and I have Richard Dunning from the University of Liverpool, and we will have a chat about his Decarbonate project. So, Richard, can you introduce yourself and give us a brief summary of the project that was funded?
Hi, Carl. Hi, everybody. I'm Richard Dunning, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Geography and Planning at Liverpool. Also worked with three other colleagues on this project. So just to give them a shout out, Alex Nurse, Andreas Siantos, and Malachy Buck also worked on this project over the course of a year, kindly funded from Decarbonate. The project assessed Liverpool City Region's Emergency Active Travel Fund, but it did it from a social and demographic perspective. So the fund was released by central governments in the middle of COVID as a rapid response to reallocate road spaces. And our project assessed the quality and social perceptions of both the proposal and the enactment of the EATF, particularly in relation to cycling infrastructure, to think about whether the fund contributed to the potential for long-term decarbonisation of transport in the city region.
Okay, so that's actually pretty good. But why this particular topic about bikes?
Good question. So the cycling infrastructure in Liverpool City Region is historically not great. And in comparison to several other cities around England, it's seen as being a little bit behind. So Manchester's put a lot of work into its cycling infrastructure. Bristol's another example. Even places like Nottingham, Sheffield have. And obviously London has got well over a decade's worth of investment in cycling infrastructure. But Liverpool's a city that hasn't really done that, or the city region hasn't really done that over the last 20 or so years. And so in the middle of COVID, when everybody was thinking about staying local and getting exercise from their front door, cycling infrastructure was one of the opportunities to encourage people to do that. And so the government released this funding, and Liverpool was very successful in winning the funding, or the city region was. And so we thought it would be an interesting case study to look at a place where cycling infrastructure isn't particularly great, but temporary infrastructure could be used as a mechanism to encourage people to change long-term behaviours and change their travel behaviour from commuting by car to commuting by bike.
What was the most surprising thing that you found during this project, and basically what was surprising about it, I guess?
Before the project started, there was a survey by Sustrans which showed that the vast majority of people in the city region wanted more cycling infrastructure. So the timing of the survey was perfect. It was pre-COVID, gave us a population that were not thinking about COVID at all. Then COVID came along, changed perceptions, changed behaviours, changed thought patterns. But at the same time, cycling infrastructure improved. And one of the things that we saw was some very noisy arguments that basically said the cycling infrastructure is poor and having a negative impact on travel efficiency and businesses. And those loud voices managed to persuade the council to remove some of the cycle lanes. And so there's a pretty famous picture now of a local councillor celebrating as they pulled out the temporary cycling infrastructure. In place-based decarbonisation views, a pretty regressive step. But those loud voices basically won over the political argument, despite the evidence that there was demand for cycling infrastructure, evidence of it being used, and evidence of people wanting that cycling infrastructure to continue. So I guess the thing that would most surprised us is just that the majority didn't really have their views listened to, or at least as consistently as we would have hoped. In a way, in a social sciences perspective, that's not that surprising. But I think that was surprising for some of the people we talked to around infrastructure and around cycling infrastructure that thought it would have been fairly clear, kind of democratically, that this was a good thing to do and therefore it should be supported. But the political change was quite interesting for us to watch.
I can see where you're coming from, because as I said, I've lived in parts of the world where cyclists are considered evil people and the motorist is considered king. From a place-based approach, did you see any changes in that, or was that even strengthened by what you saw by them ripping up the cycleways, as it were?
My guess is, in terms of a place-based approach, you could take two different views. One is you change perceptions within that locality, you understand perceptions within that locality, and you work with perceptions in that locality, and then provide infrastructure that relates to that. Or you can take a step that says place matters, but we need to provide the infrastructure and then work with people to see how perceptions change over time. So there are examples of that elsewhere in the world where that's been incredibly successful. Places like Ghent, you know, famously, when the mayor or the commissioner for transport said he was going to change the structure of the city, got sent a bullet in the post and had police protection. They changed the whole city layout. They led by example through kind of politicians leading the way. And then after that, he was elected with a massive majority as people saw the changes that had taken place and actually thought this was a good and positive step for the city. So, I mean, there's a classic planning tension there in terms of place-based decarbonisation. How do you work with people, but also how do you lead people into a future that's probably going to be more desirable for the majority? And that's difficult. There are no shortcuts to that. And we have actually seen people stepping up to do more of that. And nationally, I think there are opportunities to work with new organisations like Active Travel England to help support local authorities and put things in place to potentially help them to lead some of those arguments rather than just being responsive to them.
You know, is it getting to the point that we can increase cycle lanes and still retain the public perception that they're beneficial? Or are we at the risk of, you know, I won't say the V8 car drivers, because there are probably some of them that are not quite upset by that statement, but you know what I mean, the big heavy cars that say we need to be on the road and the bike should be somewhere else. Is that happening, that we're seeing more of that, or are we seeing people accepting that cycling is actually a way for people to travel to and from work, and not just for health reasons as well?
There is evidence that the cycling infrastructure that was put in place and that has been put in place since, so some of it was temporary and some of it's been removed, but some of it's continued, and new cycling infrastructure has actually gone in Liverpool since the pandemic lockdowns. And there is evidence that that's being used. So there is evidence of expansion there. There is evidence of use. There is hope there for that argument, that it's not simply temporary. And there is evidence of societal readiness. The argument I would make there about societal readiness is it is more than just the cycle lanes. It has to do with a whole infrastructure across society that needs to be used to support cycling. So from very basic things like having bike lockers at schools, so the kids aren't getting on wet bikes at the end of the day and being expected to cycle home in the rain. You know, they might cycle home in the rain, but at least the bike will be dry when they get on it. Through to cycling infrastructure, kind of getting from A to B, and then also things like workplaces, putting showers in at workplaces, all of that stuff that's not hugely complex and not actually particularly expensive, but is quite an organizational difficulty. It requires many people to come together to actually sort out the way that the cycling infrastructure works on the whole. In terms of us being ready to do it as a society, I think if you look at the shift to EV, you know, there are problems with the shift to EV, but the scale of its expansion was not seen 15 years ago. And the scale of its growth really does suggest that society is willing to adapt and change as long as it can have four wheels and lots of rubber behind it. But I think that's the same societal acceptance is still in place for cycling as well. And there is the opportunity there now to push for that. So the big lesson for me is I assumed at the start of this that a temporary signal from the local authority would have a change in long-term behavior. And I think that's the big thing for me, that short-term signals are only okay if they're followed with a long-term commitment. So people see the long-term direction of policy. They don't just react to the short term. And so we need to signal long-term commitment to cycling infrastructure if we're going to see a long-term change in behavior. So that's the big thing, I think, for me, is seeing the long-term commitment, political commitment, particularly.
Do you think we can ever get that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think other places have done it. If you look, London is the case, I think, where they have just said we're going to do something about congestion in the city, and we're going to allocate road space for cycling, and that's going to be a long-term commitment, and people have got to deal with it.
But I lived in St Helens when you were doing this work, and the bike lane was put in St Helens, and that's still there because I still go through that. But in Southwold, there's lots of bike routes, but there's nothing. As you get closer and closer to Liverpool, the bike routes start to disappear, or start to basically put you on the pavement, or put you right in the middle of, let's be honest, roads you really wouldn't want to go down with 35-ton trucks coming behind you.
Yeah.
So it's, if there was a way to make it so that you could go, I wouldn't say on the countryside, so you know, the road where there are sections that you can ride safely without having to worry about being clipped because somebody can't see you.
The regional connections are significant. I think we need to. There's very little work done on that, and so Sheffield is quite interesting because Sheffield's historic design was so that it had parks that ran out from the city centre into the peaks, basically. So it doesn't matter where you live in the city, you could get into a park, and then you could follow that linear park out and get out into countryside. And I think that's what we need for cycling as well. So we need to sort out city centres, but we also need to let people get out into the suburbs and beyond the suburbs through those arterial routes in a leisurely way. It needs to be done in a way that's not risky, and in a way that means people can be relaxed about that, whether they're going for a Sunday pootle on their bike, or they need to commute into work within a kind of relatively short time frame.